In a city ruled by corruption and fear, one woman holds the key to unraveling a dangerous conspiracy that stretches from the lowest ranks of the police department to the highest levels of power. Tiana Rosewood wasn't supposed to be a threat. When she was pulled over late one night by two officers, Reese and O'Connor, what seemed like a routine traffic stop quickly spiraled into something darker. Drugs were planted, charges were filed, and Tiana was arrested. But what these officers didn't know was that Tiana wasn't just an ordinary woman. As the case unfolds, dark secrets begin to surface. Tiana discovers that the police department is at the heart of a massive criminal operation, one controlled by Captain Frank Kowalski, a man who has operated in the shadows for years, untouchable and protected by those in power. But this time, he's made a mistake. Tiana is prepared to expose the truth, but doing so will put her life on the line. Reese and O'Connor aren't just corrupt, they're dangerous. And Kowalski? He's the type of man who makes problems disappear. Betrayals, hidden alliances, and a dangerous game of cat and mouse will unfold as Tiana moves closer to the truth. But the deeper she digs, the more dangerous it becomes. And when the truth finally comes out, it will shake the entire city to its core. Who is Tiana Rosewood really? And why does Kowalski fear her so much? Stick around to find out. Trust me, you don't want to miss how this one ends. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the action. Also, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Let's get into it. The hum of the streetlights buzzed faintly above the darkened sidewalks. It was a quiet night in Brinkhaven, a city that slept with one eye open. A light drizzle misted the air, coating the black asphalt in a reflective sheen. The city's heartbeat was subtle yet restless, a soft tension humming beneath the surface. A sleek black sedan crawled through the empty streets. Behind the wheel sat Tiana Rosewood, her long fingers gripping the steering wheel with quiet steadiness. Her dark brown eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror, scanning the road behind her. Calm on the surface, but her mind was working at a rapid pace, calculating every turn, every streetlight, and every shadow that moved in the distance. Tiana had been in Brinkhaven for 6 months now. She had settled into a small apartment overlooking the river, blending into the background like a ghost. A quiet librarian during the day, a mysterious figure by night. She had learned the rhythms of the city, the late-night shift changes at the police department, the movements of the city's wealthy elite, and most importantly, the patterns of the Brinkhaven Police Department. And tonight, something was off. A sudden flash of red and blue lights exploded across the darkened road behind her. The sharp wail of a siren followed. Tiana's jaw tightened as she signaled to the side and eased her car onto the shoulder of the road. She watched in the mirror as the patrol car rolled to a stop behind her. Two figures stepped out, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter with a wiry frame. Their navy blue uniforms reflected the glow of the streetlights. License and registration. The taller one barked as he approached the driver's side window. His name tag read Reese. Tiana rolled down her window slowly, her expression cool and composed. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" "You failed to come to a complete stop at that last intersection," Reese replied, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered weapon. Tiana's gaze remained steady. "I'm fairly certain I stopped." Reese's mouth curled into a cold smirk. License and registration. Tiana's pulse quickened. She reached toward the glove compartment and retrieved her documents. Her movements were precise, deliberate, calm. She handed the papers to Reese, who studied them with an air of mock importance. He murmured. "Local address. And yet, you don't look familiar." "Just moved here a few months ago," Tiana replied smoothly. Reese leaned down toward the window. "And what exactly brings you to Brinkhaven?" "Work." "What kind of work?" "Archives. County library." Reese's eyes darkened slightly. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Tiana's brows lifted slightly. "May I ask why?" The second officer, O'Connor, stepped toward the trunk of her car and tapped it lightly with his flashlight. "Looks like we got something back here," he said. Tiana's heart rate kicked up a notch. "That's impossible. I know it's in my car." Reese's smirk widened. "Yeah? Well, Let's take a look, shall we? Before Tiana could respond, O'Connor popped open the trunk. Tiana stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the wet pavement. Her eyes narrowed as she rounded the back of the car and saw a small plastic bag sitting at the edge of the trunk. A clear plastic bag, filled with white powder. "You got to be kidding me," Tiana said, her voice low and sharp. Well, Reese drawled. "Looks like you've got yourself a little problem." "That's not mine," Tiana said evenly. "Yeah, they all say that." O'Connor grinned. "Possession with intent to distribute. That's gonna look real bad on your record." Reese's hand clamped around Tiana's wrist as he spun her toward the trunk. "Hands behind your back." Tiana tensed. Her instinct screamed at her to break free, to strike, but she forced herself to remain calm. "For now, you're making a mistake," Tiana said. Reese's grip tightened. "Yeah, we'll see about that." Metal snapped around her wrists as the cold bite of handcuffs sank into her skin. As Reese led her toward the squad car, Tiana's dark eyes locked onto his face. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Reese's smile was thin. "That's funny. I was about to say the same thing." The ride to the precinct was quiet. Tiana sat in the back of the squad car, her hands cuffed behind her back, her face impassive. Reese and O'Connor sat in the front seat, laughing under their breath. "Just another idiot thinking they can outsmart the system," O'Connor muttered. Reese's eyes met hers through the rearview mirror. "You're going to go down for this, sweetheart." Tiana's gaze was unflinching. "We'll see." They pulled into the police station and Reese hauled her out of the car. He led her through the front entrance, where other officers lounged at their desks, exchanging glances and quiet laughs. "Big bust," one of them called. "Yeah," Reese replied. "Caught her red-handed." Reese guided her to the fingerprinting station. "Hands," he ordered. Tiana's eyes narrowed. "I want my lawyer." Reese chuckled. "You'll get your lawyer." Eventually, Tiana allowed him to take her prints, her expression steady. But beneath the surface, her mind was already working. This wasn't an accident. The drugs were planted, which meant this wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger. The sound of heavy boots echoed down the hallway as Captain Frank Kowalski entered the room. He was older, with silver hair and a cold expression. He stopped in front of Tiana, eyes narrowing slightly. "Who's this?" "Drug bust," Reese said. "Caught her with product in the trunk." Kowalski's gaze sharpened. "Is that so?" Tiana lifted her chin. "That's funny, because those drugs weren't there when I left my house." "Sure they weren't," Reese muttered. Kowalski's eyes lingered on her for a long moment. Then he smiled thinly. "Book her." Tiana's eyes darkened. "That's going to be difficult, considering that I've already contacted my lawyer." Kowalski's smile sharpened. "And who would that be?" Tiana's lips curled into the faintest of smirks. "You'll find out soon enough." Locked in a holding cell, Tiana sat on the cold metal bench, her legs crossed, her hands resting in her lap. Outside, Reese and O'Connor leaned against the wall, their laughter muted through the thick glass. "You really think you've got her?" O'Connor asked. Reese's grin widened. "Oh yeah." Tiana's eyes gleamed darkly through the bars. Not for long. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. The small holding cell was cold, with steel bars that cast thin, gray shadows across the cracked concrete floor. The air was damp, carrying the faint scent of bleach and stale sweat. Tiana sat on the metal bench, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Her expression was calm, too calm for someone in her situation. The dim light reflected off her dark brown eyes, which remained fixed on the narrow window high on the far wall. Outside the cell, Reese leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes held the gleam of a predator that had just trapped its prey. "She's quiet," O'Connor muttered, pacing near the cell door. "Too quiet." Reese's smirk widened. "She's trying to play it cool." "They always do." Tiana's gaze slid toward them through the bars. Her expression was impassive, but her mind was working furiously beneath the surface. She had let them arrest her. That was part of the plan. The planted drugs, the smug look on Reese's face. It was all too neat, too clean. Someone wanted her out of the way, and the only way to find out who was to let the game play out. O'Connor's boots echoed off the concrete floor as he approached the bars. He leaned down, eyes narrowing. "You look pretty comfortable for someone who's about to be booked for felony possession." Tiana smiled faintly. "I've been in worse places." "Is that so?" Reese's gaze sharpened. "Mind telling us where?" Tiana's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You wouldn't believe me." Reese's eyes narrowed, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "Try me." Tiana leaned forward slightly, her eyes glinting with quiet confidence. "Maybe another time. I have a feeling you'll be seeing a lot more of me soon." Reese's smirk faltered for a brief second before he recovered. He stepped away from the bars, exchanging a glance with O'Connor. "Take her to processing." O'Connor unlocked the cell. The heavy metal door creaked open. "Let's go." Tiana stood slowly, her movements smooth and precise. She allowed O'Connor to take her by the arm and lead her down the narrow hallway. The station was alive with low murmurs and the occasional ring of phones. Officers lounged behind their desks, sipping coffee and exchanging lazy jokes. Reese trailed behind Tiana, his eyes on her back. They approached the booking desk, where a young officer named James Keller sat behind a computer. His uniform was neatly pressed, his hair combed with precision. He couldn't have been older than 25. Keller looked up from his screen, his eyes widening slightly when he saw Tiana. "What's the charge?" "Drug possession," Reese said smoothly. "Intent to distribute." Keller's brows pulled together in confusion. His gaze drifted toward Tiana, then back to Reese. "Are you sure about that?" Reese's jaw tightened. "Do you have a problem, Keller?" Keller hesitated. "No, sir." He reached for the keyboard. "I'll start the paperwork." Tiana's gaze lingered on Keller for a moment. His hesitation was brief, but it was there, an opening. Reese leaned down toward Keller, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't think too hard about it, rookie. She's just another piece of trash off the street." Tiana's lips curled slightly. "He's nervous. You'll need to sign off on this," Keller said quietly. Reese snatched the paperwork from his hands and scrawled his signature across the bottom. He handed it back and leaned down toward Tiana's ear. "You've got one shot at making this easy," he said softly. "Take the deal when it comes. Otherwise, things are going to get real difficult for you." Tiana's expression didn't change. She stepped forward, her voice calm. "That's an interesting offer, but I'll pass." Reese's smile tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but a voice cut through the room. "Uncuff her." Tiana's head turned toward the sound of slow, measured footsteps echoing down the hallway. A tall, sharp-featured woman in a tailored navy blue suit approached the desk. Her silver hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her pale blue eyes cut through the tension in the room like glass. Reese's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you?" The woman smiled faintly. "Elizabeth Calder, District Attorney." Reese's posture stiffened. "This is a police matter." "Not anymore," Calder replied coolly. "Release her." Reese hesitated. "I said," Calder repeated, her eyes darkening. "Release her." Reese's jaw flexed. He gave a reluctant nod to O'Connor, who stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs from Tiana's wrists. The metal fell away with a soft click. Tiana rubbed her wrists lightly, her expression calm. "That was fast." Calder's eyes narrowed slightly. "We've been watching Brinkhaven PD for a while now." Reese's eyes darkened. "You have no authority here." Calder smiled thinly. "Actually, I do. And if you have a problem with that, I'm sure the Attorney General's office would be happy to explain it to you." O'Connor's hand slid toward his baton. "This is a mistake." Calder's gaze sharpened. "What's a mistake is the evidence you planted in her car." Reese's smirk faltered. "Excuse me. We have traffic cam footage showing her car at the time of the alleged incident," Calder said smoothly. "And wouldn't you know it, there was no bag of drugs when she left her house." Tiana's eyes glinted darkly. "Told you." Reese's smile vanished completely. "Let's not make this any messier than it already is," Calder said, stepping closer. "Let her go, or I can start issuing subpoenas." Reese's mouth tightened. His eyes slid toward O'Connor, who hesitated. Then Reese took a slow step back. His smile returned, but it was colder this time. "Fine. Let her walk." Calder's gaze remained hard. "Smart choice." Tiana's eyes lingered on Reese for a long moment. "We'll see each other again." Reese's smile twisted. "I'm counting on it." Tiana turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Calder followed close behind. As they stepped out onto the cool night air, Calder's sharp gaze cut toward Tiana. I've been tracking Reese and his crew for months. He's got powerful connections. You getting arrested, it wasn't random. Tiana's smile was faint. I figured as much. Calder's eyes narrowed. You're not just a librarian, are you? Tiana's gaze darkened. No, she replied. So what are you? Tiana's smile sharpened. You'll find out soon enough. Reese watched through the glass as Tiana disappeared down the street. His expression was hard. She's trouble, O'Connor muttered. Reese's eyes darkened. Yeah, but we'll handle it. Reese's smile sharpened. Oh, we'll handle it. Tiana slipped into her car, her expression calm as the engine hummed to life beneath her hands. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A single message glowed on the screen. Phase 1 complete. Awaiting further orders. Tiana's smile widened. Let the games begin. The night outside was thick and humid, the air hanging heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and cigarette smoke. Tiana sat behind the wheel of her black sedan, parked along the curb outside a dimly lit bar. Her dark eyes scanned the street through the windshield, taking in the late-night activity. The shuffle of tired feet, the flicker of neon lights reflecting off the rain-slicked pavement, the occasional shadow that moved too deliberately through the alleyways. Her mind was already assembling the pieces of the puzzle. The planted drugs, the smug expression on Reese's face, Calder's sudden intervention. It was all too calculated to be a coincidence. Someone powerful had put Reese and O'Connor in motion, and that someone had been watching her for longer than she realized. She tapped her fingers lightly against the steering wheel, her jaw tightening. She hated being reactive. It wasn't her style. But tonight had shifted the game in a dangerous way. And now, it was time to strike back. Her phone buzzed softly on the console. Unknown number. Tiana lifted it to her ear. Yes. A smooth voice drifted across the line. Male. Controlled. Dangerous. You made quite a splash tonight. Tiana's eyes narrowed. Who is this? Someone with a vested interest in seeing you out of the picture. Then you'll be disappointed. Not necessarily, the voice replied. You might be more valuable than I thought. Tiana's hand tightened on the wheel. Cut the games. Who's behind Reese? A low chuckle. Now, why would I ruin the fun? Let's just say Reese is well connected. And you've upset the balance. Balance, Tiana repeated, her voice low and sharp. Brinkhaven runs on a delicate system, Agent Rosewood. Reese is just one part of it. And you've started shaking the table. Tiana's gaze darkened. Good. Careful, the voice warned. Shake too hard, and the table might collapse right on top of you. The line went dead. Tiana lowered the phone slowly. Agent Rosewood. They knew exactly who she was. Tiana parked her car behind a narrow brick building on the outskirts of downtown. The alley was dark, lined with rusted dumpsters and broken glass. The back entrance was locked, but she reached beneath the ledge of the doorframe and retrieved a spare key. Inside, the room was small and spare. No windows, a single desk, and a thin cot along the wall. Files were stacked neatly along the shelves. A pair of laptops hummed quietly beneath the soft glow of a desk lamp. Tiana settled into the chair, unlocking one of the laptops. Lines of encrypted text scrolled across the screen as she entered her credentials. She accessed the Brinkhaven Police Department's internal database through a backdoor portal that had taken weeks to build. A list of names populated the screen: officers, chain of command, case files. Reese and O'Connor's names were near the top. But then she saw another name. Frank Kowalski, Captain. Tiana's eyes narrowed. Reese was dangerous. But Kowalski, he was the head of the Snake. A man with 20 years in the force, decorated for service, beloved by the community, and quietly feared by those who knew better. Reese wasn't working alone. Kowalski was protecting him. Tiana pulled up a secondary window, financial records. And there it was. Large, undocumented cash deposits into Reese's account. Regular, consistent. Paid through a series of shell companies linked to offshore accounts. Dirty money. Tiana's lips curled. Got you. The bar was dark, the smell of stale beer hanging in the air. The low pulse of music throbbed beneath the surface. Tiana sat at the far end of the room, her back to the wall, nursing a glass of whiskey she had no intention of finishing. Across the room, Reese and O'Connor sat at a corner booth, their postures relaxed, but not careless. Reese's eyes flicked toward the door every few minutes, his gaze sharp beneath the guise of indifference. O'Connor leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. Tiana rose from her chair and crossed the room. Reese's eyes tracked her as she approached. His smile was thin. "Well, if it isn't my favorite librarian." Tiana slid into the booth across from him, her expression neutral. "Drinks are on you, I assume." O'Connor chuckled. "We're celebrating. You should be flattered." "Celebrating what?" Reese's smile widened. "Your first strikeout." Tiana leaned forward, her gaze dark. "Funny. I was thinking the same thing." Reese's smile tightened. "What do you want?" Tiana's gaze didn't waver. "The truth." Reese's smile thinned. "Careful. You might not like what you find." "Try me." Reese's gaze darkened. "You think you're clever, don't you?" "I don't think," Tiana replied evenly. "I know." Reese's hand tightened around his glass. "Listen closely, sweetheart. You're stepping into territory you don't understand. This city, this department, it runs on order. People like you don't get to disrupt it." "People like me?" Tiana's eyes sharpened. "You know what I mean?" Reese said coldly. "You're an outsider, a tourist. You don't belong here." Tiana's smile didn't reach her eyes. "That's the problem with people like you. You think you own the ground you stand on. But you forget." Her eyes flashed darkly. "The ground can shift." Reese's jaw flexed. "Walk away, Rosewood, before you get hurt." Tiana stood slowly. She leaned down toward Reese, her lips close to his ear. "You're going to fall, Reese," she said softly. "And when you do, I'll be the one standing over you." Reese's smile disappeared completely. Tiana's heels clicked softly as she walked away, leaving the heavy silence in her wake. Tiana was halfway to her car when the streetlights flickered. A sudden shape moved into shadows to her left. She turned sharply. A hand closed around her arm. "That's far enough," a low voice growled. Tiana's elbow shot out, slamming into the ribs of the figure behind her. The man grunted, stumbling back, but another figure appeared from the darkness, grabbing her wrist and twisting it painfully behind her back. "Bad move," Reese's voice whispered against her ear. Tiana's foot shot backward, connecting with his knee. Reese hissed, his grip faltering just long enough for Tiana to twist free. She drove her heel into the side of his head, sending him crashing to the pavement. O'Connor appeared from the shadows. "We should have done this earlier." Tiana's hands curled into fists. "Try it." O'Connor lunged toward her. Tiana sidestepped, catching his wrist and spinning him into the side of the building. His head connected with a dull thud. He slumped to the ground. Reese staggered to his feet, blood running down the side of his face. His eyes blazed. Tiana smiled coldly. "This is only the beginning." Reese's mouth twisted. "You're going to regret this." "No," Tiana said softly. "You will." Tiana slid into her car, adrenaline still burning through her veins. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. A message flashed across the screen. "Target identified. Proceeding to next phase." Tiana's smile sharpened. "Game on." The early morning light filtered weakly through the blinds of Tiana's small apartment. She sat at her desk, back straight, a steaming mug of coffee resting untouched beside her laptop. The screen cast a soft glow across her face, reflecting the long string of financial records and internal police memos scrolling down the display. Frank Kowalski's name appeared over and over, linked to suspicious financial activity, unfiled case reports, and questionable asset forfeitures. The web of corruption stretched far deeper than she had originally thought. Tiana's eyes narrowed. Reese and O'Connor weren't just dirty cops acting on their own. They were the foot soldiers in a carefully constructed operation. Drugs, stolen assets, protection rackets. Brinkhaven PD had transformed into a criminal enterprise, with Kowalski at the top of the pyramid. Her phone buzzed beside her. A message flashed across the screen. DA Calder, "I need to see you." "Now." Tiana shut the laptop and stood, grabbing her jacket from the back of the chair. She pulled it over her shoulders, her movements swift and precise. Her mind was already turning, calculating the next step. This was the moment the scales would tip. The district attorney's office was housed in a gray, aging building downtown. The lobby was cold and clinical, the walls lined with faded portraits of Brinkhaven's former prosecutors. Elizabeth Calder's office was at the end of a long hallway. The door was already open when Tiana arrived. Calder stood behind her desk, arms crossed. Her steel-gray suit was crisp, her pale blue eyes sharp beneath the edge of her silver hair. Tiana closed the door behind her. "You said it was urgent." "It is." Calder's gaze darkened. "Sit." Tiana slid into the chair across from the desk. Calder placed a thin file folder on the desk between them. "Reese and O'Connor." Tiana's eyes flicked toward the file, but didn't reach for it. "What about them?" "Two internal complaints were filed against them last year. Both disappeared from the record. The complainants, a local business owner and a public defender, left town shortly afterward." Calder's gaze sharpened. I dug a little deeper. "Financial irregularities. Missing drug money. Suppressed assault charges." Tiana's jaw tightened. "Kowalski?" Calder nodded slowly. "Kowalski? How far does it go?" Calder's mouth twisted. "Far enough that the mayor's office is covering for him. The city council, too. Brinkhaven PD's funding increased by nearly 40% last year. Most of that money? Unaccounted for." Tiana's gaze darkened. "They've turned this town into a front. And you're in the middle of it," Calder said coolly. Tiana leaned forward. "Which means we need to make a move. Fast." Calder's brow lifted. "What do you suggest?" Tiana's smile was cold. "A sting." Calder's gaze sharpened. "Reese and O'Connor will never flip." "Maybe not," Tiana said. "But if Kowalski feels the pressure, he'll crack." Calder's eyes narrowed. "And how do you intend to apply pressure?" Tiana's smile didn't reach her eyes. "By giving him exactly what he wants." Tiana sat at the end of a long bar, a dark whiskey in front of her. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and sweat. The bar was dimly lit, the clientele rough around the edges. Reese slid into the seat beside her, a dangerous smile curling at the edge of his mouth. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said. "I wasn't expecting to be here." Reese's smile widened. "I'm flattered." Tiana's eyes glinted darkly. "You shouldn't be." Reese leaned toward her. "Why not?" "Because I'm about to make you an offer you can't refuse." Reese's brow lifted. "Now you have my attention." Tiana's gaze sharpened. "You want me gone?" "I'm willing to make that happen." Reese's expression darkened. "Go on. I have access to certain sensitive information," Tiana said smoothly. "City contracts, federal oversight records, the kind of information that could sink Kowalski." Reese's gaze sharpened. "And you're offering this why?" "Because I'm tired of fighting a losing battle." Reese's smile curled. "Smart girl." Tiana's smile was cold. "Not done yet." Reese's eyes narrowed. "What's the catch?" "I want out. Clean." Tiana leaned forward, her eyes locking on his. "Erase the charges. Clear my record. Make it disappear." Reese's smile widened. "And in exchange, you'll give us Kowalski's dirty laundry." Tiana's smile sharpened. "Exactly." Reese studied her for a long moment, his eyes dark and calculating. "You've got nerve." "I'm used to playing high-stakes games," Tiana replied smoothly. Reese's eyes gleamed with dark amusement. "Fine. We'll set up a meet. Tomorrow night. Warehouse at the edge of town. Bring the files." Tiana's smile didn't waver. "I'll be there." Outside the bar, Tiana pulled her phone from her jacket pocket. She dialed quickly. Calder's voice answered on the second ring. "Well, you took the bait," Tiana said. "And the meet?" "Tomorrow night. Warehouse on the edge of town." Calder's voice sharpened. "You realize how dangerous this is." "That's the point." Tiana. "He'll come armed," Tiana said. "But so will I." "You better be sure about this." "I am." Calder's voice tightened. "I'll have a federal team standing by." "Good," Tiana said softly. "Because when this ends, it's going to be loud." The warehouse was dark and cavernous, the cold concrete floor slick with moisture. A single hanging light bulb swayed from the ceiling, casting long shadows against the walls. Tiana stood near the center of the room, a black leather jacket over her slim frame. A thin manila folder rested in her hand. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Reese emerged from the shadows, O'Connor trailing behind him. Both men were armed. Tiana's gaze remained steady. "You brought the files?" Reese asked. Tiana held up the folder. "Right here. Good girl." Tiana's smile was thin. "Let's not waste time." Reese stepped closer. "Not so fast." Tiana's gaze darkened. "You've got what you want." Reese's hand settled on the butt of his gun. "Not everything." Tiana's expression sharpened. "Careful, Reese. If I die, this file goes public." Reese's smile tightened. "You think you're in control here?" Tiana's gaze hardened. "No, but I'm not the one sweating." Suddenly, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night air. Reese's expression twisted. "What the hell?" The doors to the warehouse exploded inward as a team of FBI agents stormed inside, rifles raised. "Drop your weapons," a voice shouted. Reese's eyes widened in shock. His gun lifted. Tiana's foot shot forward, kicking the gun from his hand. Reese lunged toward her. Tiana pivoted smoothly, driving her elbow into his throat. Reese hit the ground hard. O'Connor's gun rose. A single shot echoed. Reese's hand clutched his shoulder as he collapsed to the floor. Tiana stood over him, her eyes cold. "I warned you," she said softly. FBI agents moved in, securing Reese and O'Connor in handcuffs. Calder's sharp gaze cut through the chaos as she stepped into the room. Tiana tossed the folder toward her. "You've got enough to bury them." Calder's mouth curved faintly. "You just made a lot of enemies tonight." Tiana's eyes glinted darkly. "Good." Reese sat slumped in the interrogation room, his face pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. His wrists were cuffed to the metal table, the steel biting into his skin. Blood crusted at the corner of his mouth where Tiana's elbow had connected the night before. His dark eyes were hard, but behind the facade of control, Tiana could see the cracks forming. Tiana stood across the room, her arms crossed, her back straight. Calder leaned casually against the wall beside her, a thin smile curling at the edge of her mouth. Two FBI agents stood at the door, their rifles held loosely at their sides. "You know what I admire about you, Reese?" Tiana's voice was calm, almost friendly. "You're consistent." Reese's mouth curled into a thin smile. "Glad to know you're a fan." Tiana's gaze darkened. "I didn't say it was a compliment." Reese's smile sharpened. "I'll walk." Calder's brow lifted. "On what grounds?" "Insufficient evidence," Reese said smoothly. "I didn't pull the trigger. O'Connor did." Tiana's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Funny, because last I checked, aiding and abetting a federal crime still counts." Reese's gaze sharpened. "You think you've got me?" "I know we've got you." Reese leaned back, his eyes glinting darkly beneath the harsh light. "Then why am I still breathing?" Calder pushed off the wall and stepped toward the table. "We want Kowalski." Reese's smile faded. Tiana's gaze narrowed. "We know you're just a middleman. Kowalski calls the shots. He's the one who's been protecting you, running the drug money, shielding the evidence." Reese's jaw flexed. "You don't owe him anything," Calder pressed. "You're already going down, but you don't have to go down alone." Reese's gaze dropped toward the table. His breathing quickened. Tiana stepped closer. Her voice dropped, low and sharp. "He's not going to save you." Reese's eyes flashed toward her. "Kowalski already cut his losses," Tiana continued. "You think you're special? You're not. He'll throw you to the wolves to protect himself." Reese's expression tightened. "Shut up. You think you're the first dirty cop Kowalski's used and tossed aside." Tiana's voice sharpened. "You've seen the pattern. How many officers before you disappeared? How many just vanished?" Reese's breathing quickened. "You don't know what you're talking about." Tiana's gaze didn't waver. "Don't I?" Reese's fist tightened. Calder's smile sharpened. "Make a deal, Reese, or we'll make sure you're sharing a cell with O'Connor." Reese's eyes darkened. "And trust me," Tiana's voice softened dangerously, "O'Connor isn't nearly as loyal to you as you think." Reese's jaw clenched. A muscle jumped in his cheek. "Talk," Calder said, "or sink." For a long moment, Reese said nothing. Then his shoulders slumped. His head bowed. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and tight. "Kowalski runs the network. Drugs, weapons, protection. He has contacts in the mayor's office, city council, even a few state-level politicians. He decides who gets promoted, who gets benched, and who disappears. Tiana's gaze darkened. How long? 10 years. Maybe more. Calder's eyes narrowed. And what's the connection to the money? Seizures, Reese said bitterly. They collect the cash and drugs from busts. Only most of it never makes it to evidence lockup. Kowalski launders it through front businesses, bars, auto shops, construction companies. And the drugs? Reese's mouth tightened. They get lost in the chain of custody. Show up in the streets a few weeks later. Half the dealers in this city are on Kowalski's payroll. Calder's smile sharpened. Names. Reese's jaw flexed. I want a deal. We'll consider it, Calder said. When we have names. Reese's eyes glinted darkly. In protection. Tiana's smile was cold. We'll protect you. Reese's gaze sharpened. From Kowalski? No. Tiana said softly. From O'Connor. Reese's eyes darkened. He'll kill me if he gets the chance. Not if we get to him first. Reese's gaze flicked toward Calder. His jaw tightened. Then slowly he nodded. Fine. 2 hours later, Tiana and Calder sat across from each other in the DA's office. A thin manila folder rested between them. Calder flipped through the papers slowly, her expression hard. It's worse than we thought, Calder said. Tiana's gaze darkened. How deep? Kowalski's operation extends into state and federal contracts, police union funds, even political donations. Calder's mouth curled thinly. We're talking millions in untraceable money. And the mayor? Calder's eyes sharpened. Complicit, direct ties to at least 3 shell companies. Tiana's mouth tightened. We have enough to indict Kowalski, Calder said. But we'll need to move fast. If he gets wind of this, he'll disappear, Tiana finished. Calder's gaze narrowed. And take half the police department with him. Tiana's eyes darkened. Then we hit him before he sees it coming. Calder's brow lifted. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Tiana's smile was cold. By getting invited to the party. The fundraiser was held at a sprawling estate on the edge of the city. Marble columns lined the entrance, and luxury cars lined the circular driveway. The night was crisp and cool, the stars barely visible through the haze of city lights. Tiana's heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she ascended the wide staircase. She wore a sleek black gown, her hair pulled back into a low knot. A diamond bracelet glittered at her wrist, concealing a small wire beneath the metal. She passed through the grand foyer, her gaze sharp beneath the veneer of quiet elegance. Kowalski stood near the fireplace, a glass of scotch in his hand. His silver hair was neatly combed back, his tailored suit crisp and flawless. He was surrounded by a half-circle of city officials and business leaders. Tiana's eyes narrowed. The elite of Brinkhaven, all gathered in one place. Perfect. Kowalski's gaze slid toward her. His mouth curled faintly. He lifted his glass in a quiet salute. Tiana, he said smoothly, I didn't expect to see you here. I'm full of surprises, Tiana replied. Kowalski's smile sharpened. So I've heard. Tiana stepped toward him. We should talk. Kowalski's gaze darkened. Yes, we should. Tiana's smile didn't reach her eyes. But not tonight, Kowalski said smoothly. Tonight is about celebration. Tiana's gaze sharpened. What are we celebrating? Kowalski's smile widened. Survival. From across the room, Reese's pale eyes tracked Tiana's movements. His hand tightened around his glass as Kowalski leaned toward her, his mouth curving darkly. She's making a mistake, O'Connor murmured from beside him. Reese's eyes narrowed. Maybe. O'Connor's smile sharpened. Or maybe we just found her weakness. Tiana's lips curved faintly. Let them think they have the advantage. She lifted her glass toward Kowalski. To survival, she said. Their glasses touched with a sharp clink. The night was heavy with tension. A storm brewed beyond the city's skyline, the distant rumble of thunder vibrating beneath the cool night air. Tiana sat in the back seat of a sleek black sedan, her eyes fixed on the shadowy outline of the warehouse across the lot. Her gloved fingers rested lightly on her thigh, her breathing calm and measured. Calder's voice drifted from the earpiece in her ear. We have eyes on the perimeter, agents in position. Tiana's gaze sharpened as she scanned the darkened alleyways surrounding the warehouse. What about Kowalski? Confirmed, Calder replied. He's inside. Reese and O'Connor are with him, along with at least 5 others. Armed, most likely. Tiana's lips curled faintly. Good. Are you sure about this? Calder's voice sharpened. Tiana's dark eyes flashed beneath the glow of the streetlights. We've come too far to stop now. Once you're in, we may not be able to extract you. I don't need an extraction. A beat of silence. Then Calder's voice softened. Just be careful. Tiana's smile was thin. Always. Tiana slipped out of the car, her heels silent against the wet pavement. She moved toward the warehouse, her silhouette disappearing into the shadows. The metal door was ajar. She pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. The warehouse was cavernous. High ceilings exposed steel beams and the faint stench of oil and mildew. A single hanging light bulb flickered above a long metal table. Kowalski stood at the far end of the room, his expression calm and composed beneath the dim light. He wore a dark suit, the sleeves rolled up slightly. A glass of whiskey rested in his hand. Reese and O'Connor flanked him, their eyes cold and calculating. Tiana's gaze slid over the rest of the room. 4 other men lingered near the walls, muscular, dressed in black, hands resting on concealed holsters beneath their jackets. Kowalski smiled faintly as Tiana approached. Punctual. I like that. I'm efficient. Kowalski's gaze sharpened. We'll see. Tiana's heels clicked softly against the concrete floor as she stopped a few feet from the table. Let's not waste time. Kowalski's smile widened. Business before pleasure. I can respect that. Reese's mouth curled. She brought the files. Tiana reached into her coat pocket and retrieved a thin manila folder. She tossed it onto the table. Kowalski's gaze remained steady as he lifted the folder and opened it. Inside were carefully compiled financial records, falsified case files, and evidence tying Brinkhaven PD to a long string of drug busts and asset seizures. Kowalski's expression darkened slightly as he scanned the documents. His mouth twitched faintly at the edges. You've been busy, he said. Tiana's eyes gleamed. I'm thorough. Kowalski's gaze lifted toward her. And you expect what? Money. I expect you to make me disappear. Kowalski's smile didn't reach his eyes. Tempting, but you've made a mistake. Tiana's brow lifted. Have I? You think this is leverage? Kowalski's smile sharpened. You think I'll let you walk out of here after this? Tiana's expression didn't change. Yes. Kowalski's gaze darkened. And why would I let you do that? Tiana's smile sharpened. Because you're already surrounded. Kowalski's eyes narrowed. Excuse me. Tiana's voice was soft and dangerous. You didn't check the roof. Suddenly, the hanging light above them exploded in a burst of sparks. The men near the walls drew their guns, and the warehouse erupted into chaos. Glass shattered as tactical ropes descended from the ceiling. Federal agents in black body armor dropped into the room, rifles raised. Drop your weapons, a voice thundered. Gunfire erupted. The sharp bark of automatic fire cut through the air. One of Kowalski's men lunged toward Tiana. She sidestepped, driving her knee into his ribs and twisting his arm back until bone snapped beneath her grip. Reese drew his gun, but Tiana's foot shot out, kicking the weapon from his hand. She spun, driving an elbow into his face. Reese hit the floor hard, blood streaking down his jaw. O'Connor fired a shot. Tiana dropped to one knee, the bullet skimming past her shoulder. She whipped a knife from the inside of her sleeve and flung it across the room. It embedded itself in O'Connor's hand, making him scream. His gun clattered to the floor. Kowalski stood calmly at the center of the chaos, his eyes dark and calculating as agents swarmed the room. You've overplayed your hand, Rosewood. Tiana's smile was razor sharp. No, I played the long game. Kowalski's eyes narrowed. And you just lost. Calder stepped through the smoke, her sidearm raised. Frank Kowalski, you are under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and obstruction of justice. Kowalski's gaze flicked toward Tiana. This isn't over. Tiana's smile sharpened. Yes, it is. Kowalski's mouth curled. I guess we'll see. Federal agents surrounded Kowalski, twisting his arms behind his back and locking him in cuffs. Reese and O'Connor lay groaning on the floor as agents hauled them to their feet. Tiana stepped toward Reese, crouching down beside him. "I told you this would happen." Reese's eyes flashed with hate. "You think you've won?" Tiana's smile was thin. "I don't think. I know." Reese's mouth curled. "You have no idea what you started." Tiana leaned closer, her eyes glinting darkly. "Oh, I know exactly what I've started." She straightened as agents dragged Reese and O'Connor toward the exit. Calder's gaze slid toward Tiana. "Clean." Tiana's smile widened. "Told you." Calder's mouth curled faintly. "Let's get out of here." An hour later, Tiana stood beneath the flicker of a streetlight, the cool night air brushing against her skin. Calder approached from behind, her heels clicking against the pavement. "You pulled it off." Tiana's eyes narrowed. "It's not over." Calder's brow lifted. "Kowalski's going to prison. Reese and O'Connor will turn state's evidence. Brinkhaven PD is about to implode, and someone will try to fill the void." Calder's gaze sharpened. "And what are you planning to do about that?" Tiana's dark eyes flashed beneath the streetlight. "Stay in the game." Calder's mouth curled. "I suppose you've earned it." Tiana's smile was faint. "I don't play for trophies, Calder." Calder's eyes narrowed. "What then?" Tiana's smile darkened. "Control." She turned toward the street, disappearing into the night. Deep inside a maximum security holding cell, Kowalski sat alone. His wrists were shackled to the steel table. His head bowed slightly. A door opened, and a figure stepped inside. "Reese." Kowalski's eyes lifted toward him. "You held up well." Reese's gaze was dark. "We're not finished." Kowalski's mouth curled faintly. "Not even close." Tiana stood beneath the city skyline, the cool breeze cutting across her skin. She stared down at the darkened streets below, her hands resting lightly on the metal railing. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. A single message appeared on the screen. "Phase 2 begins now." Tiana's smile sharpened. "Game on." The Brinkhaven courthouse stood cold and ominous beneath the early morning light. Gray clouds gathered above the tall stone columns, casting long shadows across the marble steps. The air was thick with quiet tension, the kind that settles before a storm. Tiana stood at the bottom of the steps, her eyes fixed on the courthouse entrance. She was dressed in a tailored black suit, her heels clicking softly against the pavement as she ascended the steps. Her face was calm, but beneath the surface, her pulse thrummed with anticipation. Today was the day. Today it would all come crashing down. Federal agents stood guard near the courthouse doors. Media vans were lined up along the street, reporters murmuring behind raised microphones. A cluster of protesters gathered nearby, holding signs that read, "Justice for Brinkhaven. No more dirty cops. Hold them accountable." Tiana's gaze slid toward the crowd as whispers followed her up the steps. They all knew who she was now, the mysterious woman who had unraveled the deepest corruption in Brinkhaven's history. She ignored the murmurs and entered the courthouse. Inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. Officers in dress uniforms lined the walls, their faces impassive but tense. The press gallery was full, cameras pointed toward the empty defendant's table at the front of the room. Tiana took her seat at the prosecution's table. Across from her, Reese and O'Connor sat behind their defense attorney. Their expressions were cold and composed, but Tiana saw the tension in the rigid lines of their jaws, the slight twitch of Reese's hand as he gripped the table. Kowalski was seated beside them, dressed in a gray suit, his silver hair neatly combed back. His expression was calm, his dark eyes calculating. Judge Harold Fitch entered the courtroom, his gavel echoing through the tense silence. "All rise." The room stood. The judge took his seat. Judge Fitch's gaze slid toward the prosecution. "Ms. Calder, are you ready to proceed?" Calder stood beside Tiana, her expression sharp and composed. "The prosecution is ready, Your Honor." "And the defense?" Reese's attorney, Malcolm Hardwick, stood. He was a sharp-looking man with salt and pepper hair and a predatory smile. "Ready, Your Honor." Judge Fitch's gaze hardened. "Then let's begin." Calder moved toward the center of the room, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice calm and measured. Over the past several weeks, you have heard testimony, seen evidence, and witnessed the unraveling of one of the most extensive corruption networks in this city's history. Her gaze slid toward Kowalski. You have seen how Captain Frank Kowalski and his officers, Reese and O'Connor, used their positions of power not to protect this community, but to exploit it. Kowalski's expression didn't change. You have seen how drug money and seized assets disappeared into the hands of men sworn to uphold the law. You have seen how witnesses were intimidated, cases were fabricated, and evidence was manipulated to serve their interests. Calder's eyes sharpened. And you have seen how, when confronted with the truth, these men did not deny it. They doubled down. She turned toward the jury, her voice steady and sharp. Today, we ask you to do what they have failed to do. Uphold justice. Calder stepped back toward the table. The prosecution rests. Hardwick rose from his seat, straightening his tie as he approached the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth, what we have seen over the past several weeks is not a corruption scandal. It is a witch hunt. Tiana's gaze narrowed. My clients are decorated officers with decades of honorable service. They have protected this city from crime and violence. And now they stand accused based on circumstantial evidence and the word of a woman with questionable motives. Hardwick's gaze slid toward Tiana. Tiana's expression remained calm. You are being asked to condemn men who have given their lives to this city based on incomplete evidence and politically motivated accusations. Hardwick's smile widened slightly. I trust you to see through this spectacle. He stepped back toward the defense table. The defense rests. Judge Fitch's gaze darkened. We will now hear closing remarks from both sides. Calder's gaze sharpened. She rose to her feet and stepped toward the jury box. The defense would like you to believe that this is about loyalty, Calder said calmly. That because these men wore uniforms and carried badges, they should be granted immunity from consequence. Her gaze sharpened. But a badge is not a shield. A uniform is not a license to break the law. She gestured toward Tiana, and it was only because of the bravery and determination of one woman, someone who saw the truth and refused to look away, that we stand here today. Calder's eyes hardened. This is not about loyalty. It's about accountability. She returned to her seat. The prosecution rests. Hardwick stood. The defense calls Captain Kowalski to the stand. A hush fell over the room as Kowalski stood slowly. He straightened his suit jacket and walked toward the witness stand. His steps were measured, controlled. Tiana's eyes narrowed. Kowalski sat and adjusted the microphone. His expression remained calm as Hardwick approached. Captain Kowalski, Hardwick began, have you ever accepted bribes? No. Have you ever falsified evidence? No. Did you order officers Reese and O'Connor to participate in illegal activity? No. Tiana's gaze darkened. Hardwick smiled faintly. No further questions. Judge Fitch turned toward the prosecution. Ms. Calder? Calder stood. No questions, Your Honor. Tiana's eyes narrowed. Calder wasn't pressing him. Kowalski's gaze slid toward Tiana. His smile widened. He thinks he's winning. But Tiana's smile sharpened. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. The courtroom was silent when they returned. The foreman stood slowly, a sheet of paper trembling in his hand. In the case of Frank Kowalski, we find the defendant. A pause. Guilty. Kowalski's mouth curled. In the case of Darren Reese and Brian O'Connor, we find the defendants. A sharp intake of breath. Guilty. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters surged toward the front of the room. Kowalski's smile didn't fade. You think this is over? He murmured toward Tiana. Tiana leaned down toward him, her eyes cold. No. Her smile sharpened. This is just the beginning. Kowalski's gaze darkened. You don't know what's coming. Tiana's gaze didn't waver. Neither do you. Federal agents surrounded Kowalski, pulling him to his feet. You've made enemies, Kowalski murmured. So have you, Tiana replied. Kowalski's gaze sharpened. See you soon. Tiana's smile was cold. Not if I see you first. Outside the courthouse, Tiana stood beneath the gray sky. Calder approached, standing beside her. You did it, Calder said softly. Tiana's eyes glinted darkly. We did it. And now? Tiana's gaze slid toward the horizon. Now we rebuild. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A single message. Target eliminated. Awaiting next assignment. Tiana's smile sharpened. Game on.